Oh.
Looking back on it, it seems like such a stupid idea. Big loyalist march throughout Dublin, past the GPO and past the scene of loyalist bombings in the 70s and all this, but no one really seemed to have figured this out, that there'd be so much disruption. And of course O'Connell Street was a building site at the time because they were regenerating it, and there were these stacks of building materials and stones and all the rest of it, and of course they became missiles and the place was absolutely destroyed and cars were set on fire and all the rest of it, and made headlines throughout the world. A friend of mine was writing an article for a college newspaper, and I had the only decent camera hanging around the place, so he said, would you mind coming up and taking a few photos? And I said, of course I would. So I went down early, and it started off on Parnell Square, the way these things do. And there were about 200 kind of Republican Sinn Féin kind of guys hanging around, and the atmosphere wasn't too nasty. It's just a bit like an angry Paddy's Day at that point, with no kids and everyone wearing Celtic jerseys. And yet there was still a bit of a sense of humour. There was this one banner, and I remember it said, "Welcome to your capital," which I thought was insulting and funny at the same time, and it should have stayed at that kind of level, but of course it didn't. Now all the loyalists, it was a Love Ulster parade, which is really supposedly to commemorate victims of IRA violence and the like. But there were some really, really hardcore loyalists involved, and marching bands and pipe and drums and all the rest of it. And they played all the kind of sectarian songs as well, the sash and all that. So it was pretty tense up there on Parnell Square, really, really tense in fact. And that became just a lot worse when we heard kind of fireworks and bombs going off, and it sounded like a huge old riot down on O'Connell Street. And of course we later found out that that's exactly what it was, a big riot when people took on the guards with their stones and fireworks and all the rest of it. So it became pretty clear that the plan, which was to march all the way from there to here, couldn't happen. So they piled everyone onto buses, and at that point we were kind of thinking, you know, should we get on this bus with all these loyalists, and what's going to happen to us? And you know, I'd never even met a loyalist before. I was brought up a Catholic. I was an Ulster boy as a kid, and so to be surrounded by it probably sounds really strange to anyone who lives anywhere near the border or in Northern Ireland, but to be surrounded by all these DUP flags and Union Jacks and all the rest of it, very strange experience. And we decided we were probably safer getting on the buses rather than walking past Republican Sinn Féin, so we got a police escort all the way down here, the sirens blazing, and it was cool. It was really, really cool. And we were sitting in the corner of the bus, down the back, fidgeting, kind of wondering, well, should we lie if anyone asks who we are, or what's going on here? Well, we didn't quite know, but we made it down here, and they'd cordoned off the entire street. So there were Alsatians all around the place, protecting us from the rioters. They marched for probably about 100 metres past Leinster House. There'd been nothing like that since probably the 20s. I quickly realised I was the only one with a camera. There were no journalists around. The street was sealed off at that end and that end by Gardaí, the riot squad, and Alsatian dogs. And I got this shot of a marching band with their immaculate blue uniform and DUP flags walking past the dial there, and I didn't think much more of it because there were sirens blazing all around us. Everyone was stuck on buses and ferried off back up north, and we decided that this time, no, we didn't fancy going up to Belfast on this bus. We might as well just walk home. And we walked back up to O'Connell Street after all that drama, and we saw the state of the place. It was destroyed. There were burnt out cars everywhere, burnt out motorcycles even, which is pretty impressive. As we were walking past O'Connell Bridge, there was a Garda baton charge. The baton charged a few hundred people off the bridge. And we didn't know anything about this. We heard it, but we didn't see it. And very surreal, very scary. It was like kind of news footage from Palestine or something like that. You wouldn't have thought that this was Celtic Tiger Dublin, but of course it was. Next day I went home to my folks and we were looking at the papers, the Sunday papers, and we realised that no one had any photographs of anything that had gone on down here in Kildare Street. And my dad and my mum were really encouraging me to, send these photos in to someone who could possibly use them rather than let them sit there. And I hummed and hawed for a few hours. I rang the Irish Times and they were a bit sceptical. I didn't hear anything from a while, and they rang me back saying, yeah, they're pretty good photos, pretty good. And I was saying, no, they're not good photos, they're terrible photos, but they're the only photos, and if you want to use them, go ahead. And they said, yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah, because it's historically significant, so let's see. Anyway, later on, about 8 or 9 o'clock Sunday night, they rang me saying, yeah, we love the photos, and it's going to be the lead in the newspaper the next day. One thing that struck me is just one last thought, is that isn't it weird how Dubliners rioted over that, and yet they've spent the past decade putting up with a health service that seems to be based on some kind of voodoo magic, or they've had their economy ruined by a very small group of business people who should be in jail, or they've had to put up with a government that's done more damage to their own city than probably any other government has since independence. Very weird.